What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the Rantin review here on the YouTubes. And today we're talking about 10 pro wrestling phrases that you should know. Over the years, and particularly in the late 80s and the early 90s, way into the 2000s, kayfabe, which is a term you're going to learn later on in this one, but basically believing that what was happening on the screen in wrestling was the truth, became kind of passe. We kind of broke kayfabe throughout the years. Vince McMahon, of course, started this by admitting that what they were doing in wrestling wasn't exactly a sport. And they did that to avoid some taxes and fees and permits that you have to have in order to put on a wrestling show that were kind of common at the time. As that has gone away, even more has fallen away from the veneer of what pro wrestling was. Kind of a lot of looking behind the scenes started happening, and nowadays, for better or worse, in some people's opinions, worse, many wrestling fans know what goes on behind the scenes, and some of the vernacular that has come from behind the scenes of the industry of pro wrestling has become commonplace. So if you're new to pro wrestling and you're looking around, you're probably going, what are these people talking about? Well, here I am going to explain 10 phrases that are used commonly amongst the wrestling community, some of which are probably used incorrectly or have changed over the years. The first one we're going to talk about is a mark. Mark is kind of a complicated one because the actual original term mark, it comes from gambling, where you would be at like if you were at a gambling table, there would be the mark, or the person who would easily fall for a con. This is also used in a lot of underground kind of shady businesses, let's say, where you're trying to con somebody and you can pick out the mark from the crowd of people, and that's the person you as a shyster or a salesman are going to try to go after. This applies to wrestling in the old days, where marks were kind of referred to as the fans who believed the con of wrestling, the fans that believed that wrestling was real and all the conflicts were real and all the characters were real and it wasn't a show. This kind of evolved or devolved or went askew, depending on who you talk to now just kind of mean another wrestling fan that you don't like, essentially. You'll see somebody online today on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and they'll be in an argument with another wrestling fan, and they'll be like, you're just a mark, blah, 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 blah. In more rational terms, it's kind of also means today somebody who just gets really, really into the storylines of a wrestling show. You'll hear people say mark out, which will be when, something exciting happens in the show. And, even announcers will say it on broadcast. I'm marking out right now. They're totally buying in to the storyline. They're totally enjoying what's going on the screen. Smart or smart mark is a different term. Now, again, it had an old term and it has a new term. Smart mark was essentially a person back in the day who knew that wrestling was scripted. I would probably have been a smart mark as a kid, who knew that wrestling was scripted, but still enjoyed watching the show and could get in to the show, suspend our disbelief to get into the show. Nowadays, again, it's more of a negative, derogatory term meant for somebody typically who knows more about wrestling than just what WWE presents, and then goes and talks about it to somebody who only knows what WWE is, and then they get called a smart mark. I really never understood why that was I understand why, but it doesn't really make too much sense to be kind of a knock on somebody, because you're saying somebody's smart and they know more than you do, so whatever. Buried. This is one that I absolutely hate. The term buried, the way it's used now, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's been used in different ways in the past. Essentially, what it used to kind of be to some people was that if you were a wrestler on a show and you didn't get booked a lot, you were considered buried, being basically you couldn't see this person. They were so buried underneath everything else on the show that you never saw them. So like if X-Pac was prominent at one point on a WWE Monday Night Raw or SmackDown or whatever, but then he wasn't involved in any major storylines, you didn't see him on TV that much, people would say that that person was buried. Nowadays, it's just kind of whether or not you lose a match that you should lose, or a person that is really popular with the fans doesn't get used in the way the fans think they should be used, or they get kind of destroyed. Their character is made to look lesser or dumber than what the fans really think they should be. typically that's what somebody means when they refer to somebody as being buried. Heat is a bit of a hard one. Heat can mean several things. I think a lot of fans believe heat just means when people are mad at you, but heat is not necessarily just that. I mean, it is a thing where bad guys in the wrestling show will do something and the crowd will get really on them, but it can also just mean that there's just a lot of momentum given to that character coming out of a situation. Case in point, very recently on the Stone Cold Broken Skull Sessions with Jericho talked about his match with Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 19. He lost the match, but he got a lot of heat leaving the match because he lowballed Shawn Michaels on the way out of the match, and the way Shawn Michaels sold it, which is another term we're going to talk about, it got some heat for Jericho as he left the ring. So there's something there. There's also heat backstage where some of the boys and girls in backstage might not like another wrestler because the wrestler's done something or has a reputation that, a lot of people just aren't feeling them. Typically it's a negative term, but it can also mean that, again, a character has some momentum, and particularly a bad guy character has some momentum going forward coming out of a match or a skit. Kayfabe is another one. Now, kayfabe is related to another term we're going to talk about, but kayfabe essentially means that and this is what I said earlier about breaking kayfabe, that it's basically the wrestling persona. So Razor Ramon is the kayfabe character of the real life person Scott Hall. The storyline is, the kayfabe storyline is Vince McMahon and Stone Cold Steve Austin hate each other when in reality they don't. Breaking kayfabe is when a character doesn't, a wrestler goes out of character a little bit. They don't act the way that their character does on the actual wrestling show. Now, some wrestlers, Pac is one right now who doesn't break kayfabe a lot. The Undertaker famously didn't break kayfabe for decades until recently after he retired. So it is something that a lot of old school wrestling fans feel is a lost art, and a lot of old school wrestlers and people in the business think is part of the problem with wrestling today. Some others think kayfabe, the fans kind of understand that there's the kayfabe world and another world that we're going to call shoot. Now, shoot is kind of the opposite, as you can guess, from kayfabe. Shoot basically means that what's going on is real. Now, sometimes there'll be shoot matches. New Japan famously in the 2000s had some shoot matches where, WWE had the Brawl for All, where it's an actual fight. It's an actual competition between two or more wrestlers. There's sometimes I can go to the Katsuyori Shibata incident at the finals of the G1 Climax 26, where Shoot got into a brawl with some of the wrestlers from Pro Wrestling Noah, and it made a big deal, it was a big splash. It could also mean when somebody does a move that feels legitimate. Brock Lesnar legitimately shoot punched Braun Strowman in the match because Braun Strowman did something that Lesnar didn't like, and he told him to slow down and hammered Braun a couple times in the side of the head with a fist. The shoot is also applies to promos. When somebody's giving a promo, they can be in kayfabe, in character, but then sometimes they can break character and say something directly to the screen. Probably one of the more famous combinations of both shoot and work in the same promo is the infamous pipe bomb from CM Punk back in 2011. Work rate is one. That's a new one. No, that's another new one. Nobody really talked about work rate when I first got into the wrestling industry. There wasn't really much concern about this stuff back then, but the term work rate essentially means how much effort a wrestler is putting into a match. Are they doing moves? Are they trying to tell a story? Or are they sitting in what's called rest holds, which is basically when you're just putting on a headlock and pantomiming to the crowd, and you're not really doing a lot in the ring. You're kind of smoke and mirrors, trying to get the crowd invested in that. Now, a lot of people will say that old way of doing it and just grabbing a headlock and pandering to the crowd and stomping your feet and stuff, that is work. But a lot today, with the amount of talent that we have today and the amazing things that wrestlers today do that wrestlers in the past didn't, it's kind of jarring to see somebody go back to just grabbing headlocks and waving or mugging the crowd to get boos or cheers. The work rate it's a plus and a negative for a lot of fans. Getting over or going over, the term over itself is basically whether or not fans have glommed on to something. So a show could be over with the fans. Like a lot of fans could like a WrestleMania. In particular, though, it applies to a particular wrestler, whether or not that wrestler's popularity has gotten to a place where the fans have accepted the character and they're really into the character. So a wrestler who isn't over, they'll go out to the ring, they'll have a match, and the fans really aren't into them or into their character or into the promo. But other wrestlers like The Rock, who infamously was not over at all back in 1996, 1997 WWF, by the time we got into 1988, 1999 WWF, The Rock was more over than anybody else on the roster. That's an example of what being over is. Another thing about that is somebody who goes over in a match, which basically means the person who wins the match. Wrestlers who lose a lot are often termed as jobbers. Then there's face and heel, and these are relatively simple. These actually are, of all of the wrestling vernacular that's used on the wrestling community, this pair is actually used correctly and is actually going back to some old English that's brought back. And face basically means somebody who is the good guy. They are your Shawn Michaels, your Steve Austins, the people that the fans will cheer for. Heel is usually the bad guy, the person, the rule breaker, the dastardly bad wrestler. They used to call them rule breakers back in the day and fan favorites. Today we call them faces and heels. Now there are instances where somebody is supposed to be a face, John Cena, Roman Reigns, but they constantly get booed by a lot of the crowd. There are cases of wrestlers who were supposed to be heels, like take a Tetsuya Naito or a Stone Cold Steve Austin back in 1997, who's supposed to be a heel, but the fans love what they're doing so much. The NWO was another good example of this. The fans love them so much that they actually start cheering for them. There is another word in here that we can throw in called tweeners, which are guys who aren't necessarily heel or face. They kind of depends on the match that they're in and who they're going up against, whether or not the fans will cheer for them or boo for them. Right now in New Japan Pro Wrestling, you've got a guy like Zack, Sabre Jr. and Taichi, the Dangerous Tekkers, who technically they're part of a heel faction in Suzuki-gun, but when they take on Bullet Club, who are a little bit more hated than they are, the fans tend to cheer for Zack and Taichi more than they cheer for the Bullet Club guys. So those are 10 plus terms that if you're new to the wrestling community that you need to know. And I know there are some people, there's always new people coming into the wrestling community, don't know what any of this stuff means. There's some people who've been in it for a while who still don't know what some of these words mean and use them incorrectly, but that's what they are. And if you have any other definitions of these words, of course, because language is fluid, so some of this slang gets kind of twisted around a little bit. Let your voice be heard in the comment box below. Of course, this being the Rant and Review, I got some free goodies down for you guys down in the description box, so check that out to get you some free stuff, some free money, some free stocks, some free Audible links and everything else. And of course, share this video on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or wherever you like to talk about pro wrestling or sports entertainment. I got some other videos up here. I do a lot of other stuff on this channel, including video game walkthroughs and reviews of TV shows and movies. So check all that stuff out, and I will see you guys next time for more news, reviews, rumors, and top 10 countdowns here on the Rant and Review. Have a good day.